Hi everybody, Michael Davis here. Welcome to Bone2Pick. And I'm absolutely honored to have an opportunity to sit down with our featured artist for the month of July, the great Bob Millikan. Bob has been one of the most important trumpet players on the New York scene for the past 50 years, everything from Broadway shows to studio work and everything in between. He arrived in New York at the age of 18 and immediately started working on the scene. He has been lead trumpet for a who's who of the entertainment industry, including Barbra Streisand, Tony Bennett, Sammy Davis Jr., Ella Fitzgerald, Diana Ross, Nancy Wilson, just to name a few. His jazz credits include the great Chick Corea. He played on one of my favorite records of Chick's, The Leprechaun. Gil Evans, Clark Terry, Grover Washington Jr., Lyle Mays, Jerry Mulligan, a long association with the great Louis Bellson, and of course an equally long association with the great Bob Mintzer. He was a member of the renowned American Jazz Orchestra led by John Lewis. He's worked extensively with Quincy Jones, and for over 20 years he was the lead trumpet player on the Tony Awards as well as the Kennedy Center Honors Show down in Washington, D.C. And I have to say he's, not only for myself, but I think for the entire brass community here in New York, he's one of the most popular and favorite people to see on any job because of, obviously because of the playing is so spectacular, but an incredible spirit, and he brings so much to the table. A lot of times there's a lot of tension and stress when you're trying to get a recording done, and Bob has just an amazing spirit about him and a way of bringing things down to an even keel and making everybody feel comfortable. So without further ado, Bob, thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule and joining us today on Bone2Pick.
Well, thank you. Actually, it's an honor to be asked to do this because I know there's a long line of some really phenomenal musicians who've done this. And so it's just, I would not attempt to put myself in their category, but it's nice to be asked, and I appreciate the honor.
Wow, thank you, Bob. It's very nice you say, and you are certainly in that category without question. Let's jump in on your early years. You grew up in McCordsville, Indiana, on a farm, and maybe you could just talk about your early memories and what made you gravitate to music and the trumpet.
Well, my father took me to a band rehearsal. He played in this band. It was called the Sahara Grotto Band. It was like some kind of Masonic offshoot, and they did concerts and things. So he took me there, and I remember sitting back with the trumpets and watching these guys. They looked like they were like 80 years old. They were probably younger than I am now. And I thought, wow, this is exciting, the sound of sitting inside that thing. And so he bought me an old Conn cornet from one of those guys. I was only in the second grade, Christmas, my second grade. And the rest, you know, as they say, you know, so as a kid, you know, you kind of figure out as you go along things you have success in, and you know, like things that you want to do or fantasizing doing, and you do them, and you may have some success at it, but you don't see a future in it, you know, like baseball or whatever, you know, those kind of things, and you're having fun and all that. But when then when it gets down to it, you realize that, you know, the thing that you're getting the most compliments for as a kid and getting the most feedback, you figure like, hey, I'm going with this. This seems to be working.
Right.
So that was the trumpet. Yeah.
That's a great point, though. I think all of us as musicians, you get that positive feedback, and it's like, let's go in this direction.
Well, just
this
stay
is fun
with this, then. This just seems to be working.
Yeah, awesome. Well, what I find it really interesting in kind of preparing for this interview, most of the stuff I knew about you, but right out of high school, you graduate from high school and you immediately go into a professional situation on the Warren Covington Band.
Well, actually, that's true. I didn't mean to interrupt there, but I did have a day gig for a couple of weeks working in this shoe department of this sort of like it was called Zayre's or something like that, sort of like a Kmart. And of course, I didn't last long there. I got fired pretty quick, you know, when they realized I was just hanging out at the coffee bar all the time, you know. But the thing is, my gripe was that there was three of us when I started the gig, and it was just me when I got fired, and I wasn't going to do the work of the other two people. So that was my introduction to the day gig life, and I said, I'll never do this again.
Yeah. So, well, maybe we just won't even count those 2 weeks as
Yeah,
part of the
and
portfolio
then.
then.
And then a guy called me and said, "Listen," he called like it was like a call you get in the middle of the night, but don't tell anybody. I got this job that you might be interested. It was a carnival burlesque show. So, of course, at that point, I had nothing going on. So, yeah, I'll do it. I went and I auditioned. And so I did a carnival burlesque show for a couple of months. And then I got this call, thanks to my sister, who was a singer. And she was always a real, champion of my thing there. And she got this guy to call me. Jim Edison is, you guys probably heard of, in Indianapolis. And he was playing on Warren Cummings' band, but he had to leave. And so he got me the gig, and I went out and played in that band, which had the great John Von Ohlen and a few other great players in there. And that was the beginning of really sort of getting into passing that level, from the Carnival Burlesque show, which actually was a great gig. I enjoyed it. Piano and trumpet, that was it.
Oh, wow.
But the band was really, the first act was like Rosemary Clooney, and then we did the Smothers Brothers and all this. So here I am, 17 years old, and I'm just like, really, I can't believe this. This is happening. This is great. So
Yeah, very cool. So then, what was it like joining Warren Covington's band? He was a great band leader and trombone player.
Was.
And
he really was. He was a character, and but he could play, and he had some, featured numbers that he was pretty amazing, and there were some real characters on that band. As you know how bands can be. They had a lead trumpet player. I was a third trumpet. They had a lead trumpet player and they had a second trumpet player, and they both came to the gig every night with a brand new paper sack with a bottle of, a fifth or whatever, full-size bottle of vodka, and they drink that all night long, and then at the first one who finished. And this happened every night. It used to crack us all up. The first one who finished would always ask the other one for a drink. And, of course, there was a few expletives added in there when the guy would say no. And that was great. Never share.
I've heard of that happening, yeah. It's interesting. That must have been quite an experience at 17. How cool is that?
It was it was incredible, all this stuff going down,
That is awesome. Well, continuing at that time frame, so you basically did the gig for the summer and then came to New York at almost, you're still 17, but almost 18 years old.
Yeah, when the gig ended, I remember Warren, who was very instrumental in me coming to New York. He didn't promise me any work or anything, but he said, "What are you going to do now that the tour is over?" And I said, "Well, I guess I'll go back and work around Indianapolis." He says, "Well, if that's all you're going to do, you might as well just go to New York and do that." Mm-hmm. He says, you've met guys on this band, and they work with other bands, and some of them are contractors on weekend bands. And he says, you'll probably do just as well, if not better, just, starting out there. So I did. It was really like a kind of a no-brainer. It's like, oh, yeah, that sounds like a lot more fun.
Wow, that's great. So Warren Covington had a big part in you getting there at that time. I'm sure you would have ended up here.
He literally made me make the decision, in essence, which was pretty, very thankful for. There was a lot of people who were always very encouraging, and for whatever reasons, but a lot of nice people, As when you're starting out, everybody sees you as I don't know what exactly the perspective is, but as promising, let's say.
Right.
But of course, later on, that babysitting or whatever definitely goes away. You're not so charming anymore, because you're the real threat or whatever,
That's great. So this is now, we were talking about it before the interview. This is fall of 1963. Can you just share some of your memories about what New York was like to you in your eyes at that time? What do you remember about what the town was like?
Of course, I had never been to New York before. So my first night in town, guy says, some of the guys said, "Well, we'll meet at Charlie's." And I didn't even know what Charlie's was, but it was a famous hangout. It wasn't the original hangout that was apparently on Broadway and 52nd, but this was on 52nd Street, right next to where the Roseland Ballroom was. And they said, "We'll meet over there." and we'll go hear Louis Bellson's band. And I'm thought, I didn't even know who Louis Bellson was. So we go over there, we meet, we go over to the Metropole and listen to Louis Bellson's band, and it was just fantastic. It was like a who's who, Jimmy Cleveland, John Bunch, or George DeVivier,
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Phil, Gene Quill, Selden Powell, Pepper Adams. I didn't even know who these guys were. And Clyde Riesiger was the first trumpet player. I forget who else was there, but they were all, to me, it was just like, I couldn't believe my ears. I never heard a band like that, and especially up close, in the Metropole.
Yeah.
You'd literally stand in front of each player, you can hear them. So I was so overwhelmed by that, I had to find out who that lead trumpet player was, and I wanted to see if he would teach, because I was under the impression that you could learn how to do that just by taking a lesson. So I finally got his name and number, and I got in touch with him, and he was the nicest cat in the world. He did teach, and he was really a big help to me in getting into a lot of situations.
Wow.
Broadway show, nightclub. I worked at the Latin Quarter. By the time I was 19, I had a TV show, I had a Broadway show at various times, and along, semi-running steady gigs. And the Latin Quarter, I think I stayed there for about a year until I left for some reason or other. I'm not sure why. Oh, I started working in the other nightclubs in town, and that was really fun.
Mm-hmm. That was a very thriving scene, which doesn't really exist. It's so much now, but
Not at all.
You had the Copa and.
At that time, there was 4 or 5 of these things, and then I remember going. The Copa. My first sub at the Copa. Man, that was exciting. And I go in there, and Benny Powell was in the back. We're in this hallway, and I'm warming up, and being the young novice, so to speak, on this scene, I'm warming up ferociously and all this, and I never thought about this until the other day. Like this, it's like Benny Powell comes up and he says, Snooky Young, he always warms up in a cup mute, real soft. I thought, and then I realized he wasn't giving me a tip. I was irritating the hell out of him. Maybe it was a tip, but Benny was a perfect gentleman at all times, you know what I mean? This hallway was very narrow and small, and I'm like all nervous, running up and down the horn like an idiot. So the sub went great, except at the end of the sub, then one of the managers or head guys there, a captain or whatever, comes up and asks to see my cabaret card, and I said, cabaret card? Luckily, even then, I was able to come up with an answer. I said, oh, I left it at home. Then I had to go find out what a cabaret card was and go down and get one. But that was a little bit of a scary place there, as you probably heard.
Yeah. Interesting. Funny stuff.
But some great acts and great bands, and got to play with some great players there.
I love that your first night is hearing Louis Bellson, because you guys had such a connection then down the road where you did so much stuff with him over the years.
Clyde actually hooked me up on a little tour a few months later, I think it was, with Louis and Pearl Bailey, and I got to go out and play. And Johnny Bello was playing lead trumpet, and
was he living in New York at that point, or he was
he was still on the scene doing the Craft Music Hall and all. He was a big time player. And he sounded like it too. And I can't remember the trumpet player's name now. Ray. His son's a drummer who just passed away recently, which I was shocked to find out. But anyway, and Don Rader. And this was just it was like a fantasy, listening to these guys every night, And Louis, this right away, I thought, man, this guy's the greatest leader in the world. He doesn't say anything, he counts the tunes off, and plays, and everybody plays, and that's it.
Yeah.
No mystery, no dirty looks.
I know I had the good fortune of playing with Louis, with you, of course, playing lead trumpet, but that was the exact same reaction. Is like, what a great leader. He just lets it speak for itself. And if you
it's sort of like a self-cleansing situation. If you're not making it, you won't be back for whatever reason.
Yeah.
so it took care of itself, and he didn't have to say anything to anybody.
Yeah.
I heard Duke was like that, but in a different way. Guys would leave the band because I guess they felt the draft or something from the other guys, but he would never actually apparently fire them or anything.
Oh, really? Interesting.
But this wasn't a steady thing like that anyway. But
Yeah.
sure was fun.
Well, there's a lot of there's so many things about it. I feel like talking to you, you get like just a wealth of information and great stories, and this is terrific. I want to come back to some of that, but I also want to shift a little bit over to the Broadway side of your career for a moment. And it's not always our favorite work. It might be fair to say, but we're also extremely grateful for the steadiness of it, and and especially now it's such an important part of the infrastructure of work here in New York for freelance players. But maybe you could talk about, I think the thing you're most associated with is the entire run of a chorus line.
Yeah.
A 15-year run, obviously that's like, it has its pluses and minuses, I'm sure, but maybe you could just kind of share your thoughts about your time on Broadway. You're obviously still very active. You did the whole run of Hairspray, just got done with the Nice Work If You Can Get It. But maybe if you could talk a little bit about that, and how you got into Broadway and how you've seen it shift over the years, and just kind of an overview from your perspective.
Yeah. Well, I got into Broadway. Actually, my first Broadway show was because of Clyde Riesecker. He recommended me for Flora the Red Menace. That was Eliza Minnelli's first show, too. And I think she was 19 also. We were both 19. And that's when I realized that I was not really equipped or prepared to be a Broadway player because of it was more like not the notes or the music, it was the atmosphere, the pressure, and I don't know, something about it just kind of like made me kind of freak out a little bit. The simplest things seemed to be hard to play, and so I realized that if I was going to be any kind of a decent player, I had to get more experience playing lead in more pressure kind of situations because I didn't see a solo career for myself, having had the pleasure of hearing Randy and Louis Soloff and those guys who were sort of in my age group and hearing them play. And I said, man, forget that. These cats are in another world, But so this old trumpet player on Warren Cummings' band said, learn how to play lead, you always work. Well, there's some truth to that, I guess, in those days.
Sure.
But anyway, so I decided that Broadway was not in my future. And somehow or other, I got a nightclub gig, playing second trumpet or third trumpet or whatever. And then the leader calls me up one day and says, well, the first trumpet player's not coming back. I'm thinking about hiring so-and-so. And I said, okay, great. And then a couple hours later, I decided, sounds like I better call this guy back and tell him I'm interested in playing lead. And the wild thing is, he says, I was hoping you'd say that. That's what the guy said. He says, because that's what I wanted, but I wanted to hear it from you. So, I put my foot in my mouth, and and then I started out really, it's sort of like Earn While You Learn kind of situation where you're playing like in what I considered a really pretty good quality gig, especially for me, playing with, and sometimes the acts would bring in their own lead trumpet players. Like that's where I got to work with Snooky Young, and Ernie Royal, and one of the greats, Al Teresi, which a lot of people didn't know about, but Al was he was one of the greats. He was kind of like Tony Bennett's lead trumpet player at that time. And so I got to hear these guys play. It was like free lessons and getting paid at the same time, So that started me on the nightclub circuits. And pretty soon I had a situation at all the nightclubs where guys the leaders would call me if to see if I was available to play lead, which if I was, I'd jump in there because that's really all I wanted to do. And so I got these opportunities, and to me it was just all fun. It wasn't really that much of a pressure cooker like I felt playing that first Broadway show. It was like, wow, I'm playing some good charts with great players, and everything is fun, and for the most part, and few bumps in the road now and then, but and I remember this the big Broadway show contractor calling me, Morris Stanzik, asking me to do a show, and I turned it down because I really didn't, want to go back there. I didn't feel I was ready, and actually, I didn't really kind of need the work because between doing the nightclubs and then starting to pick up a few gigs during the daytime, I was very content with that. Mm-hmm. And then one day, you wake up and all the nightclub gigs are gone. You look at your bank account, and a guy, and I was subbing in a show that night. I remember the show, No Nanette. And the contractor asked me if I'd be interested in doing a show, the house contractor show called Over Here. I said, nah, I don't think so. I went home the next day. After looking at my bank account, I realized I came back because I was doing a sub again, and I said, is that offer still available? He said, yes. So that was the beginning of a long run of doing Broadway shows because it was a necessity. Mm-hmm. It was a necessity. Mm-hmm. And that particular show was fun because it was actually a big band musical on stage. And, not like being buried in a pit and feeling like, I don't know, hopeless or something. This thing was kind of fun. There was a lot of interaction with the cast, parties. It was like just fun, Mm-hmm. Good band swinging, Harry DeVito, Jack Gale, and
oh, nice.
I don't remember all the Harvey Estrin. There was a lot of great players, and it was fun. Mm-hmm. And then that closed. I did another show called Man on the Moon with that guy who was the leader of the Mamas and Papas. Phillips was his name. And this thing was so out, it was unbelievable. That didn't last long. Then I get a call from Herb Harris about an off-Broadway show. And I'd heard through the grapevine that somebody had recommended me. In fact, it was Larry Wilcox, the arranger. He recommended me for this gig. Well, Herb had called apparently every one of his ringer trumpet players that he worked with. Apparently he was a busy recording contractor. So, he had Ernie Royal and Ray Crisser and all these big names, but they all turned him down because it was an off-Broadway show. So I guess Larry Wilcox recommended me. I took the gig. He said, I'll give you, 5 doubles or whatever it was. It's off-Broadway, it doesn't pay well, but he says there's not much chance of this thing going to Broadway. Well, of course, that was a chorus line. And the rest was history, So that was just, pure dumb luck.
Did the 5 doubles carry over when you got to Broadway?
Well, there's an interesting story about that. As I guess Herb, after he saw what a horrible mistake he had made by telling me I could keep those 5 doubles if it goes to Broadway, came to me and he said, in all seriousness, he says, I'm having some trouble with the payroll. I think I may have to take one double away. I think he said 1. And, I was such a cocky, independent kind of guy. I said, okay, fine, but you can just get somebody else for this gig. And I wasn't kidding. I always had this negative reaction to anything that was,
authority related.
Yeah, that's it. And so then he leaves, and he came back in a couple hours. Says, "Okay, I worked it out. You're fine. Everything's fine." So I guess I called his bluff. Luckily, not really intending to. It was just my gut, reaction, shooting from the hip, which is not advisable if you want to stay in this business. But I was lucky, and Herb later on, I'll never forget this because later on when the show closed, he was calling me for his sessions now and then, and he had these big score productions, Mm-hmm. And so I sort of jokingly, I go up to him and said, "Hey, Herb, man, that course line turned out to be a good gig, And he smiled. I said, you get any more gigs like that, give me a call." And he says to me, "Oh, I only call young guys." I was young when I started the gig, I think I was about 29 or something.
Oh, that's good stuff.
It was funny. Yeah.
Well, the funny thing, it's in the kind of a serious mode is like on Broadway, the first trumpet, from my perspective, and I'm sure you would echo this, there's so much pressure on the first trumpet and so much attention paid to it, and it's really not rewarded enough, I think, on a financial basis. Then they do have a lead trumpet premium in New York, but it's more of a token gesture than a real amount. So the fact that whatever doubles you got were well deserved, I'm quite certain, because that is a lot of extra stress and pressure to deal with.
Yeah, and the funny thing is, when I worked in the nightclubs, I don't know who set it up, because it wasn't in the union contract thing, but most of the leaders automatically would give me an extra, $50 a week or something, which was a big deal in those days for playing lead. Without asking. It was just like they kind of had some kind of idea that was important or whatever, for whatever reason. So but Broadway kind of like never really felt that way. I think they always just sort of like everything had to be by the book and I said, well, those are minimums, man. Like those are not maximums. It's like that famous Al Pacino story about a guy calling him for a gig and offering him some money and saying, well, how's that? Is that enough? Al says, well, keep going. I'll tell you when it's enough.
The inimitable Al Pacino had the way with words, for sure, right?
Yeah, classic.
Well, let's talk a little bit about your studio side of your career, because that's certainly as prolific as any of the live playing that you've done.
Yeah.
But how did you, I think you got into that very early on as well, but how did you view that as compared to the live work that you were doing? And I was also curious as to some of the players that might have been influential to you. I know you mentioned your colleagues like Louie and Randy and folks like that, but the generation previous to that, who were you listening to that you really admired?
Yeah, talk about the greatest generation, Bernie Glow and Ernie and, Snooky and all those names that a lot of guys get tired of hearing about, but you just can't say enough about them. Johnny Frost, Joe Ferranti, Dick Perry. These guys, they'd been there and done that, and there's a lot of history with all those guys, and just to get to be around them and work with them occasionally, I never had any delusions of grandeur. I was like just really a privilege to ever work with those guys, because they were just great players with great history, and they always turned out to be really nice cats, like funny and a good time, Ernie, and they lived up to their reputation playing wise. Snooky, man, if you didn't dig that, you weren't listening, But I don't know. I kind of got off the track there, but it was those guys were. But there was a transition, like there always is in the music business. It's ongoing. It's like, those guys had all those big time leaders that they worked for. In those days, you still had all those big time arrangers in town, like Patrick Williams and
of course,
Al Cohn was a busy writer, and Tori Zito and Marion Evans, and a whole bunch of those guys.
Billy Byers in that circle of guys as well,
for sure. And these guys were all their favorite players were of their generation, which was like Bernie Glow, Johnny Frost, Doc Severinsen was still just ending his sideman career, I think, about that time in the 60s, before he started working as a leader at the Tonight Show. But that's one of the first sessions that I heard, not played at, but heard, was with Doc Severinsen and Bernie Glow and Clark Terry, and it was like the sound is still rings in my ears, like you just don't hear that, hardly anywhere, because they played differently. They were coming from more of a maybe a classical based sound or background, but they were swingers. Of course, Clark was the ultimate swinger.
Yeah, of course.
But they were a big influence. They set a really incredible standard, which thankfully it was easier to get into the recording business later on because it didn't require the same skills. You didn't have to be a virtuoso. The recording techniques became different, the punching in, the tracks, this and that and the other. Well, it became like, I never, very seldom felt uptight or nervous on a record date as I would, say, playing a Broadway show. It was just more relaxed. And the people that you were working for, of course, if they're making a record, they want it to be good. And of course, they understood apparently the basic philosophy of, be nice to the musicians, treat them good, have a good time, and everybody makes happy and good music together. So it was actually a pretty good scene.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot to be said for that, right? It's like
Yeah.
making the musicians feel comfortable.
A happy workplace, even in the office.
So huge. Would you say at that time, say in the 70s, was there a real dividing line between studio work and show playing, or was it kind of like a bit like it is now? It seems to cross. You kind of do everything if you can,
Yeah, some guys, some of the busy big name cats, adamantly kind of like refused to do Broadway, and I think it was financially speaking, they didn't need it. It wasn't an issue. Some guys did. I learned at my point that Broadway made a nice base, so to speak, and they were very, of course, they were very good to me, very lenient, let me off any time as much as I wanted to be, and so the studio thing, I had the two things to play off of each other. If the studio thing was irritating me, I could play my show, and that was fine. Or if that got to be get on my nerves, I knew I could do. I had the studio thing going, so it was for me personally, it was a good balance. I didn't have all my eggs in one basket, and it was kind of a good scene. I was able to enjoy both things without having to feel that my life was on the line all the time.
Yeah. I know I learned from you, and I think many others have, but yeah, exactly what you just said, not keeping all your eggs in one basket, because that's, especially in this business, can be a dangerous approach.
Exactly, right.
I wanted to talk about, there's so many qualities of your playing that I'm a huge fan of, as we all are here in New York, but your concept of sound, to me, is something that's remarkable in your playing. And to me, the sound and feel, those two things are really trademark qualities in your great playing. I want to talk about your role as a lead player in the big bands that you've worked with, in particular Bob Mintzer and Louis Bellson. But I was curious, before we jump into that, if you had someplace that concept of sound originated from, or was it an amalgam of hearing all these great players that you just mentioned, or how you developed your concept of sound and feel as well?
Yeah. Well, funny thing is, Mike, somebody called me a couple of weeks ago about giving a lesson, and I said, well, I don't really teach. And I was thinking about it just the other day. It's hard to, first of all, there's a lot of really good musicians out there and great trumpet players, all the technique and chops in the world, and good, decent sounds, good, decent feel, and this and that and the other. But my two strongest attributes, apparently, would be my sound and my feel, right? So those are the two things you can't really teach. How do you teach that? And as far as how do you develop it, I couldn't tell you either, except for the fact that, just by having an enthusiastic ear for listening to good music when I was a kid, it didn't seem like a mystery to me, hearing these swinging bands. Then when I try to emulate it, practicing or playing with a band, it was just a matter of just, playing with a good feel. The sound kind of just takes care of itself. Your inner ear. I see guys switching instruments and mouthpieces all the time, but basically you always get back to who you are. And it's just the luck of the draw, I guess.
I would imagine getting that you're a great musician, so you're intuitive and you're listening to what's going on around you. I imagine being around those players like Doc and Bernie and Ernie and the guys that you were fortunate to hear had to be extremely helpful.
Absolutely. And also, keenly, when I would try to pick up on more than anything else, was the approaches they used embouchure with their embouchures. That was always interesting to me because I never had really what I considered a great embouchure, and I tried changing it once and going with it. I went with it for a few years, and then a few years later I said, Went back to the original. I decided, well, I don't care how it looks. I'm just going to go with what feels good. The looks thing wasn't working because I noticed that, Snooki and Bernie and all these guys, they had these like perfect looking embouchures, like textbook, right in the, I thought, well, I'll never be that good because I could never, my teeth and my embouchure just won't work like that, So I would always ask guys like Danny Stiles, who was another great player, and how they set their embouchure when they played, In other words, like Danny would say he would put the mouthpiece on his chops, then make his embouchure. Some people will make their embouchure, put the chop, So you kind of like just like pick up these bits and pieces. Johnny Bello said he didn't practice extensively in the upper register. He would just warm up to it. And you take these little gems and little bits of knowledge and you kind of piece them together. Doc Simonson, I had the privilege of hanging out with him one day for an hour or two in this trailer, at a concert. It was at Cleveland's ballpark. And I was working with Tony Bennett, and he was on the bill doing his thing. And we were all playing with the Cleveland Symphony Orchestra. So anyway, there was a rain delay or something, and I'm hanging out inadvertently with him in the same trailer. And I noticed how we would chat, and then he'd pick up his horn, he'd do a few minutes of drills and all that. And then I started to realize later on, putting this all together, that was the ultimate way to practice and to be able to keep practicing without blowing your chops out. Some guys think practicing, you got to sit down for an hour and just keep playing etudes. I never had much success at that, except just getting frustrated and sounding like crap and getting tired. I thought, this is not working out. There's got to be a better way. Then I discovered the concept of resting. Made it a lot easier.
So true.
Yeah,
rest is like massively important for
a
brass player.
I guess weightlifters know that. They don't go to the gym and just keep lifting a weight until they can't move, But I try to impart that to other guys when they ask me, and they don't have the patience to rest. They pick up the some get away with it and some don't. But if it's not working for you, then you got to look for something else.
Yeah. Continuing on our path with that idea, can you talk a little bit about your approach and maybe just some of your favorite recollections of all the great big band playing that you've done? We've mentioned some of the things early in your career, but of late, you've been working with David Berger's great band. You've worked with David Liebman. I know you've done quite a bit of recording with him. And of course, the great Bob Mintzer, who you've been associated with. I believe you were a charter member of the band, I think.
Yeah.
So maybe you could talk about I know it's kind of like you just said, the feel thing is an elusive thing. You can't really teach that and describe it, but maybe talk about your thoughts about playing in these great bands.
Yeah. Well, I remember studying with this one particular teacher who wasn't the swingingest player, but he could swing. But his approach to music was that all music is rhythmic and swings, whether it's classical or whatever, you should have some kind of inner pulse going on. Well, my brain can't handle that kind of thing, but in any event, it does make sense. So whether you're playing rock, Latin, jazz, whatever, if you got a good feel, and say you're a good swing player, and you're playing more of an even eighth note feel, then of course common sense tells you that you can't play it with a swing feel, but you play with an even eighth note feel, but it's still supposed to swing in its own even eighth note thing, So swinging is not just an old time term. It's a way that you feel and motivate the playing, your impulse to play. Basically, everything should have a nice swing to it, you know?
Right, exactly. Making the music feel good, yeah.
If you can't play even eighth notes, then that's a problem, But if you do play them and you can't play them without a swing fill, that's a problem. But if you play them with too much of a swing, old-time swing fill, that's no good either. Everything has its own identity. I mean, I played in a lot of Latin recordings, tons of them, and Latin bands, and I'll be the first one to tell you, that's hard to really cop something that people grow up with. It's not that easy, you know, to really and believe me, I used to get very frustrated because it was always important to me to really feel good about what I was playing, but it was hard. It was hard. To this day, I'm still trying to figure out where the bass player is, You know what I mean? It's like...
I know exactly what you mean.
And
Yeah.
These Latin bands, they absolutely amaze me.
Yeah.
Man, they're like off to the races, man. They got this thing down. I wish... That's one thing that I've never really felt comfortable doing, but at least I had the common sense to know that I didn't feel comfortable doing it. And I got to play with some great Latin records with some great players, but it didn't make me a great Latin player.
Yeah.
I mean, I could sort of just simulate, but...
Yeah, I could totally...
But Mincer's band, that's a different thing. As we know, that's not flat out swing, but it is swing.
Right.
It's very much into a pulse and a feeling.
Well, the Latin aside, you certainly found your niche as being the lead trumpet player in a big band, because I know firsthand, having sat in front of you on Bob's band for so many years, it's like...
Well, I appreciate that.
You really bring something to the table that's very special.
Now, if I could just solo like you, then I'd have something.
You're too kind. Well, let's... I just want to throw out a couple of names because they're so iconic in the music world. But you've been associated with both of them, but maybe you could just share a couple thoughts. The first one would be the great producer Quincy Jones.
Oh, yeah. Well, I didn't have a lot to do with him, obviously, because I didn't live in L.A. I only had a few. I bumped up against him a couple of times, and one was a gig that Dave Berger got me on. They took a handful of us to Paris for a week to do this big tribute to Quincy Jones, and he was actually going to conduct it, Quincy, but he wasn't at the first few rehearsals. And I remember being, you hear all these stories about, well, he didn't really write that or he didn't do this. Well, let me tell you, my first-hand knowledge is this cat is good, real good. He knows what he's doing. We were doing this big production number, one of those Duke Ellington things. I forget the name of it, Harlem or something like that. One of those things that go on and on. It's fairly involved, and we were rehearsing it with the French musicians, who were quite good, especially the strings. They were awesome. Anyway. So after 2 or 3 days of rehearsal, then Quincy comes to rehearsal, and Dave's saying, well, I'm not sure how this is going to go. I don't know if Quincy knows how to conduct this number or whatever. We were just getting a heads up, and be understanding. Well, let me tell you, man, he just flew right through it. He knew everything about it. I don't know if he did homework on it or whatever, but it was very impressive, I said, well, there's one story about Quincy I know for a fact. This cat knows he knows what he's doing, And he was a really nice cat. And he was very complimentary. And, of course, any compliments from Quincy, it's like, God or something. You can't let it go to your head because, And I know Brian Peresci was on the gig, and Brian and I were talking about when Quincy shows up, we got to be cool. And Brian says to me, the greatest advice I'd ever heard. He says, well, we know we're not going to impress him. He's worked with the greatest. It's like, yeah, let's get that out of the way. That ain't going to happen.
I don't know if you remember this, but I think it was shortly after that we were doing an OJ's gig, and it was Oprah was it was her event, but it was a tribute to Quincy.
Oh yeah.
And I remember we were standing around, and you said, "Hey guys, come on, I'll introduce you to Quincy." So I was thinking, wow, how's this? Okay, awesome. I've never met Quincy. It's going to be great. And you walked up to him, and he was like, "Hey, Bob, how you doing?" And he's like, happy to see you. And he was super kind to all of us. But anyway,
that's the way he is. Yeah.
You obviously made a great impression on him. So I think Brian might have spoke too soon. I think you did impress him.
Well, and we went out to L.A. a couple of times and did some gigs that he got us also. One was playing the opening, night of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, where they have a big party for all their backers and, a concert and all that. And Quincy got us on that. And then another gig we flew out to do once was a party for Barry Gordy's I don't know if it was his daughter getting married or his partner's daughter. Or, I never did get that straight. But Quincy was there. He got us the gig.
Yeah.
And I mean, he came to the club to hear us. You know, it's just like, I don't know. He struck me as like, you can see why people would want him to be your producer.
Right.
Because he just brings good vibe to the gig, you know?
Yeah.
Like, there's no hidden agendas, at least the way he puts it out there. It's like just, it's all happiness, love, making good music. We were doing this thing once for Bill Cosby, and Quincy was conducting the band down at the Chelsea Pier, and he could count on, just the way he counted off a tune made you want to play it. It was weird like that, you know? He brought so much enthusiasm. So anyway, he has some kind of career of, you know, I remember when they were saying he was a sellout because he started doing Michael Jackson and all that. It's like,
oh my
give
gosh.
me a break.
Yeah.
Music is music, man.
He's one of the great careers in the history of music. I mean,
Yeah,
it's
absolutely.
unbelievable.
Unbelievable is right.
The other name I wanted to mention, which is completely different, also a very big star, but you have had a lengthy association with her, is Barbra Streisand.
Yeah. No comment.
Okay, very good.
Next, no. She was. I have to say, first of all, she lives up to her reputation as a singer, firstly, and the Bill Ross, the conductor. Needless to say, great cat, perfect guy for the job, knows how to handle her and us. Good sense of humor. He put up with me, and the music was on a very high level. We didn't really have much contact with her, you know. A couple of times I said hello to her or whatever, and she didn't respond, you know, so that was good. But I have nothing but good things to say about it because she didn't bug us, she didn't turn on us or any weird stories you might think would happen, you know. But she was a real pro, and she took care of business. That's about all I can say about that because it was a great gig, probably the best gig I've ever had in terms of being paid to play first trumpet. It's got to be one of the all-time great sideman gigs for a non, you know, situation, except like maybe when you were playing with the Rolling Stones or something like that. But as for a sideman just playing in an orchestra, it couldn't get any better than that monetarily. And musically, you know, it was just, you know, you heard those arrangements. It's like just music to the ears, you know. You hear those big string sections playing those beautiful arrangements, and, you know, I enjoyed it. It was work. It wasn't a vacation. You know, you always think about, well, I'm going to go here and I'm going to go there and I'm going to have a good time. Well, I had enough to play, and it wasn't a lot, but I had just enough to play that I had to spend my free time most of the time trying to keep my chops up because the gig itself wasn't enough playing to keep the chops up, but yet I had enough spots in the music, you know, where you had to play. So that's, and I figured, well, you know, they're paying me to do this, so I guess I better be able to keep on target here.
Well, I wanted to ask you about one other experience, and I mentioned it in the intro, but I know you played on the Chick Corea's the Leprechaun CD. Back then it was an LP.
Right.
I was just curious if you had any recollections of that. I'm a big Chick fan, of course, as we all are. But I wondered if you had any memories about that particular record date.
I remember that, and I remember the studio, the Electric Lady. Jimi Hendrix apparently was the originator of that place or owner initially, and I remember one thing from a technical standpoint. It was the first recording to be totally Dolby'd. And that, in those days and age, that was a big deal. But as you listen to that record, even on the vinyl, it's amazingly clear, you know. But also, then to get onto the playing, Chick Corea, Steve Gadd, Anthony Jackson, and the upright bass player, Eddie Gomez. I'm listening to these guys play, and I'm saying, my God, it's just absolutely mind-boggling. Yeah. Mind-boggling. Such genius. What the hell are they doing, and how are they doing it? And they were great, you know. Our roles in that were, you know, not that big of a deal, but of course we had to play, and it was a good. If I remember right, it was pretty good,
Did Chick do the his own
I think
charts?
he did. I
Yeah.
think he did. Yes, I think he did. Well, it was just it was an amazing experience. The guy's a genius. Let's face it.
Yeah, no
No get
question.
around that.
Yeah, no question. Well, as we kind of wind down, I wanted to just have you offer. This is somewhat of a general question, but you were here in New York and such a fruitful period, and it's obviously changed dramatically from what it is now.
Yeah.
I'm sure you had the same experience when you were, first getting to New York. Probably the generations before you were saying, "Wow, you should have been here back when."
Yeah.
And now the younger players are hearing that from us, but I was just curious as to how you look at New York now and the change that it's gone through. How you just kind of your overview of the music business in your career, and perhaps where it's going in the future.
Yeah, well, I think from a musical standpoint and from a musical standpoint, musical level, I think the level has always been high and still is. From a work standpoint, that's a whole nother ball game, because that has been like a steady graph down, due to electronics and recordings, and all this kind of stuff. So that's the sad part, but there's still the level of players are still coming and still there, and it's amazing how good all these young guys are. They're just absolutely stupendous, and somehow or other they make their way.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how they do it. Mm-hmm. It's like watching a deer in the backyard or something. They manage to survive the wintertime. So, I'd say, yeah, playing wise, of course, what the guys did when I first came to town was pretty awesome and a little different. But even the mantra then or whatever was like, well, you should have heard it before that, So I think since the 30s or 40s, I guess there was a time when even the radio stations had orchestras, So that whole thing of employment. One thing I'd say about these older studio musicians that used to, in fact, I worked with two of them in chorus line. I failed to mention this guy, Al Montliano and Jimmy Morielli, two trumpet players. Al was on staff at ABC when he was 19 and was there for about 10 or 15 years. And Jimmy Morielli was on staff at ABC for 25 years. And Jimmy used to say, I've had two jobs in my life, ABC and chorus line. And the guys were both amazingly well-rounded musicians, Jimmy, they could play classical, club dates, jazz, blah, 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 lead. Jimmy Morielli was one of the guys who most people didn't realize he was playing a lot of the lead, along with Victor on the Dick Cavett show, but a very good player, and a piano major from Juilliard.
Oh, really?
Even though trumpet was his instrument, and he could sing opera, and it was just like those kind of guys in those days. Some seriously well-rounded dudes, man.
Mm-hmm.
Louis was kind of like that, although he didn't, practice it that way that much. But Solov had that all-encompassing, kind of background, classical jazz and all that. He didn't, participate maybe in classical music that much, but I know that he knew what it was all about and what to do with it, because he had that background. He was a piece of work, man. He was beautiful.
Well, speaking of a piece of work, I've never ended an interview this way, but you are one of the all-time characters in the New York scene, and I mean that in the most positive and funny way possible. If you don't mind, if we can just go over a few classic Bob Millikan isms, if you would. And I was hoping we could get your take on him. And I was talking to some guys over the weekend, and I was telling them we were doing this interview, and they were like, some of the stuff Bob says, only Bob could get away with that. If we said that, so I'd like to lead off with the one, and I wasn't there, so I'm going to probably say it incorrectly, and you can correct me, but there was something where it was on a show, and the conductor said there was a couple of crack notes in the trumpet section for everybody, and you could tell it better, but the conductor says it's unacceptable, the amount of, and your response was?
Well, no, he wasn't. he was actually pretty nice about it, because from opening, from the the break-in period and opening night and all that, we were doing a really flawless job because you want to.
Yeah.
And I remember the show, it was Showboat, and so then after a few months goes by, he calls me and the other trumpet player in, and he says, "Guys, I love you guys, but I'm starting to hear, just a little too many little cacks." He said, not bad mistakes or anything like that, just little cacks and all that. And I'm looking at him like, oh man, is this guy serious or what? So when he finishes all that, I said, well, how many mistakes are we allowed? And he looks at me, he says, 2. I said, is that 2 per number? Or is that 2 per show? He says, no, 2 a week. And I'm looking at him and I said, man, I can make 2 on the downbeat. Will you put me on? So after I come back from the break and we were getting ready to play the evening show, he looks over at me and says, Bob, forget everything I said. I think I had him worried or something,
Another classic was we were doing a tour with Bob Mintzer's band a few years back, and we were all driving in the Midwest, and it was in February.
Yeah.
So a challenging time to be driving around.
Yeah,
and,
really.
But we all, of course, loved Bob's music so much that we'd do anything for him.
And we did, yes.
And I just remember Bob was rehearsing, and we were talking about driving in here, and then it had obviously tipped the scale where you had to make a comment, and you looked up, and it was quiet for a second, and you go, hey, Bob, I'm doing this gig for the money. Which, of course, for those of you who don't know, big band work tends to pay less, but the music is more rewarding and fulfilling. And I'll never forget Vincent's expression. He just looked for a second.
Yeah, like what?
And then he started cracking up. But it was another classic Millikan line.
Yeah, I remember the look on his face. It's like, what? What's this cat saying, And Bob was great. Man.
And another one that comes to mind is I happened to be subbing for Birch Johnson, great trombone player here in New York and one of my favorite players. And he did the run with you at Hairspray.
Yeah.
And for some reason, which rarely happens, and we're all horrified when it does, and it's a lot of tension, you were stuck in traffic that day or stuck in the tunnel, and it was really late. And John Miller, who's a very important contractor and very influential guy in the business, they had called him, and he came down.
Yeah.
And so I was kind of trying to play a couple of trumpet parts because I was subbing for Birch that day, and I'm all, my stomach's turning because John's sitting next to me, and I'm like all there. And you just walked in, you had all your stuff, and you just looked over and you said, oh, hey, John, what are you doing here?
Yeah, right.
And the thing that was amazing about it was John started laughing. He was just like, okay, man.
The irony of that is, and this is what was kind of funny and kind of, embarrassing, was he literally had just called me like either the day before or something to book me for a couple of sessions. And so as I'm driving into town after I got this call from Clint, like, where are you? Because I'd actually just forgot there was a gig that night because I had flown back from Germany or Vienna or something and kept thinking that Monday night was off or something. There was some kind of weird anomaly in the schedule and it wasn't off. And anyway, so as I'm driving down, I'm thinking, man, he's going to like not only fire me for the gig, he's going to cancel those 2 record dates, which seem to be more important to me, how you think in this business, But he was totally cool, man. I said, listen, man, I said, I didn't say anything to you that night. He says, I figured you'd heard enough bullshit. He says, that's right. I saw him the other day. He actually invited me to come to his place since I was going to be up there, and I was like, wow,
Well, and we'll close out with on the Hairspray theme. You remember the show? Hairspray had a 6-minute break before the intermission.
Oh, yeah.
And then there would be a 6-minute break, and then there would be one more tune to play, and then there would be the intermission. So evidently that particular day, Bob forgot that we were on the 6-minute portion and that the show was still going.
Exactly.
And so the dialogue was going on stage. So Bob went out of the pit, that we would all leave the pit during those 6 minutes, and Bob went back in thinking it was the intermission. and decided to go into his warm-up, which is also a trademark of yours, is your phenomenally interesting and effective warm-up.
Yeah.
And so anyway, I remember you laced right into the warm-up.
Yeah.
And I think,
Not too bad, but I'm playing up to like a high B above the staff, you know, and trying to get a sound going and everything. And then all of a sudden, in the background, I hear voices. I thought, well, why would they be rehearsing during the intermission, you know, on stage? Then I realized the friggin' show was still going on. You know, it's really Birch's fault, you know, because Birch and I used to jump up to go to the bathroom. We wanted to get there before the girls got there. We used to tell them that was only for the men, you know. One of those stupid situations.
oh, man. Well, as you can see, I could sit here for the rest of the day and tell great Bob Millikan stories.
I got
but,
one last, though.
Please,
I just
please.
And this has to do with Tony Bennett and the great John Bunch, piano player, who for some bizarre reason, took a liking to me at a very early age. And he was conducting for Tony, and he had like a string of gigs coming up where they needed a lead trumpet player, and he asked me to do them. So, and the first one, I think, was that thing in Cleveland where Doc was there and Sarah Vaughan, you know, like talk about a heavy scene, like it was wow, you know. And I'm like, what, 21 or 2 years old or something. And anyway, I'm warming up on the bandstand, you know, and here's these guys like Bernie Edelstein, first trumpet in this, you know, all these guys. And of course, I'm doing my typical warm up, you know. I don't even think about how crappy it sounds because I'm used to it, you know. And but John Bunch told me a few months later on, he says, when Tony and I heard you warming up, we thought we had made the biggest mistakes of our lives. I guess that's a good ploy because then by the time I played the show, they were so relieved, they must have thought it was the greatest, you know. That was a good one.
A great story. Well, you are one of the greatest, and you've given so much to the scene here in New York, on every level as a person and certainly as a player, no question about it. And on behalf of all brass players and musicians, thank you for that, and most of all, thanks for coming over today and making this such a great day. And the interview is fantastic. Thank you for taking the time out, Bob.
My pleasure. An honor to be asked.
Well, thanks, Bob.
Yeah.
And we appreciate you checking us out today. We'll see all of you next time on Bone2Pick.